In today's video, I'm going to cover 3 cutting techniques on the bandsaw that I consider to be absolutely indispensable. These are going to be focused mainly around tight curves that are, in theory, too tight to get around into one shot, and then straight, odd angles that pivot into a curve, which present a challenge as well. We can't just cut the angle using a fence or a table saw or something like that because we have to pivot into a curve. I use these techniques all the time. We're working with some hard maple and then some veneered pine that I did myself with walnut on it. I've had this sitting around for a long time. Let me know if that fools you and looks like a good piece of walnut or not. Anyways, we're going to start with the heavy curves though. A lot of people buy the bandsaw for these kind of things, these really tight curves. There's no other good tool other than maybe like a coping saw or some rasp or something else to do these kind of tight turns. They're probably a scroll saw, of course. But a lot of people do this on the bandsaw. So the order of operations, if I was going to cut these out, not the biggest motor in the world. I use a 1/4-inch blade kind of as my daily driver. Pretty good turn radius. The narrower the blade, the better the turn radius, but nowhere near enough to make some of these kind of inside tight loops. So how would I approach this? Well, first thing I'm going to do, and we're going to call it cut number 1, is the relief cut. We're going to strategically place kind of an escape route for ourselves, a way so that if we end up in a tight situation where we can't turn that blade, instead of having to turn the bandsaw off and back it out or perhaps break our blade due to tension, we just relieve some pressure by having a piece of wood entirely removed. So let's come in here. I'll show you at least where I would do a minimum amount of relief cuts. There's really no downside to doing more of these, so do as many as you want, and then I'll show you how I would cut it out, and then I'll show you what I would call the nibbler to refine the curves. When you see the nibbler, if there is an already established name for it, please let me know because I don't love the name nibbler, but that's just what I call it, so it's the working name. Now right off the bat, it doesn't really matter what side you're going to start cutting from. These relief cuts are going to allow us to make multiple cuts. So you can go left to right or right to left, it doesn't matter. The first thing we're going to definitely do is place a relief cut that ends up at the apex of every corner. All of these through here. I made this one a little wider so that I don't have a super narrow piece. And I also like to put relief cuts at the top apexes of the outside ones as well. All of these right here, coming in here. This one, this wide of a turn, you could probably make, but I don't really bother. I just make a bunch of relief cuts. And we're going to simply come in from the outside and put a straight line down. And then we're going to do some other cutting to just remove most of that. And then we will go through with a final cut. Now, I've noticed on especially underpowered bandsaws, if you do not have wood on both sides of the cut, the blade will deflect pretty poorly. So if we're going to make a straight cut through, we need to leave enough wood so that our blade can go through the middle. It will just deflect if we do not leave enough there. It's not a big enough motor to just kind of power through that on these bench tops. I'm also going to put one probably right in here. So I'll show you real quick how I do these relief cuts, and then I'll show you the initial cutout stage, and then we'll get into the nibbler. Like I said, there's no downside to doing more of these. I think these are one of the best ways to get a kind of clean, easy cut because you're not forcing your bandsaw to turn at an angle it doesn't want to turn at. Now for most people, myself included, our final goal here is to be able to sand to the line or sand to remove the line. That's one of the things with a bandsaw is even with a really high tooth blade, there's always going to be a little bit of a kind of rough surface. It'll be much smoother with a higher tooth blade, but on something like a 6 TPI, it's going to be pretty rough. So we have to have some material left. So we want to get either right along this blue line, or some people like to remove the line. Either way, that's fine. But what we really want to do here as the next phase is remove waste. But like I said, remember, if you want to take any of these curves as a path, you cannot remove 90% of it. The blade will deflect and it won't leave as clean of a line, though you can do that and then we can use the nibbler, but ideally we want to minimize the time taken with the nibbler because it's a little bit more slow, deliberate process. And the way I like to kind of envision this is making things a straight line. So I've got a straight line right here. I can come in and make that turn. Okay, things like that. I'm envisioning straight lines where I can just go in and back out, go in and back out. Sometimes it's fun to try to go around and cut this whole thing, but if you get stuck, it's a real pain to get it out of there. At this point, we're 85% of the way there. And if you wanted to go from here to sanding, that's fine. But if you're hand sanding and it's a hardwood like this hard maple, even just removing some of this is going to take a while. It's going to be very annoying. Maybe a rasp, something like that is going to help. If you have a spindle sander, this will help out a lot. But we can get this a little more shaped, a little nicely kind of rounded off so that our spindle sander doesn't even have to do as much work. So let's go in now and we're going to do what I call the nibbler. Now, one of the upsides of the bandsaw is it just pulls down. It doesn't pull the work into it like a table saw where a rip blade kind of grips and pulls in slightly. So there's nothing that's going to yank the workpiece in there, which means we don't have to always go straight through. In fact, we can work laterally here. Each of these teeth is slightly offset a little bit, and that gives us a little bit of a wider kind of cut berth there. So what we're going to do here, and you can go left to right or right to left or both, is we're going to just graze this as if this was like a constantly moving strip of sandpaper. We can just come across laterally here, or you can even kind of go onto the side of it and just rub up against the side. I think it's most useful to kind of come like this. And it's going to allow us to get into tight spaces because the thickness of this blade is, 0.025 basically. It's very tight, so we can get into here and we can just refine these shapes like this. I use this for both inside and outside curves. You can get an incredibly precise shape doing this, and we can remove 99% of this white area outside of our line and only have to do a little bit of shaping. Now, I would say be careful with this when you start getting to narrow edge places, as it is pulling down and you can get some chipping off. So in this kind of area right here, I wouldn't get as near to this edge. I would do that part with sanding, but everywhere else we can get really close. So we're gonna go ahead and do this, and you'll see how I get into all these corners and these outside apexes to clean this up really well before we hit the sanding. At this point, we are 98% done. We just need to go and do a little sanding to refine this, but we have removed almost all the material down to the blue line so that we can get that clean surface by just doing sanding right to the line. Those two techniques in combination, the relief cut and the nibbler, allow you to get incredibly nice tight curves without accidentally getting your blade stuck, breaking a blade, anything like that. Now, I do have some warnings with this. This is a very delicate process, and when you are in tight, if you accidentally push forward at all, you will cut straight into it. There is like not a lot of room for error here. So you want to make sure you've got two hands on it when you're pulling across. Be very careful not to go straight through. You also want to be very careful, like I said, when we get to kind of fragile endpoints here. If this kind of yanks down on that, you are going to have the really high potential for some tear out, if not chipping on the back of that. It's really good in most other areas, well, almost every other area except these extremely fine points. Just sand that down to a finish. Now, before we move on to the third technique, I just want to say that when you get thicker and thicker wood, you're going to need a kind of wider blade, something a little more aggressive. You can do it with a 1/4-inch blade on like a 2x4. It will work if you are slow and deliberate. If you're trying to go through a 2x4 equivalent of like hard maple with a 1/4-inch blade on a benchtop bandsaw, probably not going to happen, very well. It gets less and less effective the duller your blade gets. You'll find yourself getting snagged a little bit. So if you are going to do this, always kind of make sure that you know where in the kind of realm of sharpness your blade is going in. If your blade is super dull, you should probably change it out anyways, but just know you're not going to get as effective a cut as if your blade is relatively sharp when doing the nibbling. Now, just in general, I think the relief cut is smart almost no matter what you're doing. There's not that big of an improvement in terms of the cleanliness of the cut from one-shotting it versus doing it in 2 or 3 phases with relief cuts. You're going to get a cleaner surface by raising the number of teeth per inch. That's always going to be better than just straight shotting it with a low tooth per inch blade. So don't be afraid to use as many relief cuts as you want. All right, let's move into the third technique now. Right here, we've got a cut that presents a bit of a tricky problem. We want an extremely straight cut down this. Obviously, we can do some sanding blocks to get it cleaned up and totally straight, but we want to be pretty close to straight. We also, though, cannot just make a through cut. Now, if we're doing a bunch of these, we could set up a fence, clamp it down at something like that, relief cut, go through over and over. But if you're just doing one of these, you don't want to line up the fence, do test cuts, etc. We need a way to make this cut without having to go all the way through. We want to be able to transition into that curve and leave ourselves a relatively clean kind of transition. So we're going to use a new technique here, which I call the hand guide. Again, some of these may have existing names, I don't know, but we're also going to mix in the relief cut and the nibbler to make sure we get all of this in kind of unison, looking good outside of our line, but really close to our line so we can sand there. The hand guide is exactly what it sounds like. We're using one of our hands almost stationary and using the other to glide the wood along it, providing kind of a fence-like object so that we don't have to try and keep it particularly straight. We just need to keep it relatively straight. That way, we don't have to worry so much about any bandsaw blade drift. We can account for that with our hand. We're not stuck on a specific fence angle. Your hand can deviate a little bit as we're going through. Even though we're guiding it with the hand, we have the ability to adjust mid-cut. So let's come in and I'll show you how I do this. This one takes a little bit of practice, and make sure you do your relief cuts before starting this, or else you're going to have to back out, which sometimes can lead to some clanging on the sides and a little bit of a rough cut. It's not the end of the world if you have to just back it out, but it's not ideal. Now, as we talked about earlier, our bandsaw wants to just cut pulling straight down. Ideally, it works best when this blade is still in a fairly straight line. We have all these bearings and cooling blocks and everything to try to keep it from twisting back and forth. So we want to take advantage of just the kind of straight line. Now, we obviously can't just run our normal fence up here. We need this at an angle. Like I said before, if you have a bunch of these to do, you could definitely kind of clamp down something to get this right. But if you're only doing one, you don't want to have to do all this setup. Here's how I do this with the hand guide. Now, our first little entrance takes a little bit of work. We have to kind of get our bearing straight from the beginning. We can't truly know where exactly to place our hand quite yet, but we're certainly going to look for it as we get in that first, half inch or so. We can take a pretty good guess and give ourselves kind of just a rough straight line, and we're going to use, I guess this depends on what hand you are. I'm right-handed, so I use my left hand as a guide. I like to have a finger, if not two fingers, mainly just one finger kind of up here on this area. Watch out for the blade, of course. This one's going to be on top, applying downward pressure, and this one's going to be in the back here, also just helping pull this through. You can go something more like this as well if that makes you feel better. Either way, we just want at least one finger preventing us from going out to the side and at least one finger giving us some pressure down. Now, as I said before, we'd like to kind of come behind this and try to line this up, but I guarantee as we go in most of the time, we're going to have to do a little deviation. But we want to pivot a little bit, and if we need to move back and forth, we can, but we don't want to be using this to go through. It's very easy to get off track when you're trying to push with both hands because trying to apply even pressure through is difficult. So let's go through and do this. And just like that, we've got our shape cut out here. Now, not my best work. I went a little bit into the line at some points, but like I said, it's a little awkward standing behind the camera. Normally, I am way up here with my face basically into this thing, so a little different, but I'd be okay with this. I can still sand away to this line and be fine. Again, notice the relief cut first so that when I get here, I don't have to try to come back because it's very easy to slap the inside of this, leaving you with a rougher cut. That is much easier to sand right there than something with a gouge kind of in it. I've got the relief cut. I then come through here. I probably should have cut one into this turn. It was a little hard on the bandsaw, I could tell, but I made that turn. I came through here, and then I just nibbled my way so that that transition is nice and smooth. That's not going to take a whole lot of sanding at all to get through. Very happy with that. Well, that's going to do it for us today. Hopefully these techniques will help you improve your kind of turning radiuses, your corners, leaving you less work to do when it comes to sanding. I think these are great ways to get kind of straight lines into curves and tight curves without having to make it in one whole shot and either having a tinier blade you have to buy or perhaps getting stuck and having to somehow try to back out from a tighter radius. I love this Raycon bandsaw. In case you're looking for recommendation, 3061, absolutely great. If you can afford something bigger with a bigger motor, a bigger kind of resaw capacity, do it. But these work extremely well, and as you can see, I'm able with hard maple to get incredibly tight little turrets. Anyways, thanks for joining me today. Bye.